right. Hey, everyone. How's it going? I'm Matt. Nice to meet you all. Hope you're having a good conference so far. I know this is one of the very first events. Just to help me get a sense of who's in the audience, could you raise your hand if you're a developer? Great. OK. And could you raise your hand if you're not a developer? OK. This is very helpful. Thank you. All right. So today, I'm going to be talking about Arbitrum Orbit. As you mentioned, as you heard earlier, this is a way to kind of permissionally launch your own chain. There's a lot going on here. Launching a chain is very different than launching an application, so I'm going to try and hopefully make that a bit easier to understand. So you're probably all very familiar with this, but it's important to go over this again. So how do we get here, right? We wanted these decentralized programmable databases, so we had kind of this whole L1 paradigm. We wanted cheaper access to block space, so we found L2s. Now we have kind of canonical scaling solutions, though obviously this is arguable. And now there's kind of a growing interest in using this block space for different ways than we're kind of used to. Folks want flexible, custom chains. This is kind of how we got to the term app chains. The ZK Sync team was just talking about layer 3s. This is how we got to the concept of Orbit. So you might ask yourself, okay, what is Orbit? And we heard the spiel. What does that actually mean? Okay, so the important thing to understand here is the most important thing is it's a way to permissionlessly launch your own Arbitrum chain. So right now, you can launch a layer 3 chain at will. What that means is launching a chain on top of Arbitrum 1 or on top of Arbitrum Nova. There's an emerging structure around deploying a separate L2. Obviously, you'll hear more about that from other folks in the industry. One important note to think about here is obviously governance, while important, is kind of a process, right? It takes time for teams to adopt changes. So when you launch your own chain, if there are developments to the technology, you can adopt them at will. Now, this is important for some teams, less important for others. The other thing to think about with Orbit here is that it's an extended ecosystem of multiple chains. We talked a lot about this, I think, last year at DevCon, but abstracting block space away from users is really important to actually get folks to use products. So when you have multiple chains and when you have services that allow users to switch between those chains kind of seamlessly at will, it's another step in abstracting block space away from user interaction. The other thing is they're fully interoperable with other EVM chains, right? So if you have an application on one chain and you launch an Orbit chain, you can deploy it there. Kind of the same benefits that you get with Arbitrum chains today, but just important to remember. The other important thing to discuss here is that this is a production-grade solution. So you can launch a roll-up chain. Average cost 5 to 10 cents per transaction, depending on what you're doing, with interactive fraud proofs. Or an AnyTrust chain, which again, some folks aren't familiar with this, but there is a way to launch a chain with a data availability committee. This is, transactions will cost a fraction of a cent, but there are additional kind of, infrastructure overhead things to think about when you're going to set up one of those chains. The other thing is there's native customization that will continuously be integrated into the core protocol, into the core repo that you can deploy these chains from. So, as things come online, as teams make choices and we kind of aggregate that and understand what folks actually want to have standard, that will become part of the solution. So something, unfortunately, I'm not going to do a demo of how to spin up one of these chains, but you can go do that right now if you feel like it. We have a deployment portal where you can kind of walk through, choose what kind of chain you want. Within around, I think, 10 minutes or so, as long as you have the corresponding Sepolia ETH, you can deploy one of these chains. You can customize the type of chain right now, just choosing between a rollup and an AnyTrust chain. You can specify the fee token that you want as long as it's live on the parent chain. And you can customize things like the number of validators that you want, the addresses of the batch poster, et cetera. So this is something that you can do right now. It's been live for a few months. The other interesting thing is if you've deployed this chain, you want to start testing with it, you want to have, you kind of understand the transaction flow between the parent chain and deposits into the child chain, you can actually go to our front-end bridge, take the information from the deployment that you've just spun up, paste it into this box, and now you have a working UI that'll allow you to bridge and withdraw into and from the chain that you've just deployed. So just want to make sure that folks have an understanding of the fact that there is tooling available for this. There's a lot of changes we have planned, but want to cover that kind of quickly. So this is an interesting slide. Just quickly, there's a lot of existing options for teams that are considering deploying an application and maybe are considering deploying an entire blockchain, which is not an easy feat. There's obviously already existing layer 2 chains, right? The L2Beat folks have a huge list of all the things that you can kind of consider, but it's important to realize that when you're thinking about deploying a chain, there are already chains that exist that you can deploy your applications on. It's not a race to deploy a chain. There's lots of app chain solutions as well, right? So when you're choosing between the type of framework that you want to use, there are many different options. There's stacks, there's CDKs, SDKs, there's subnets and other ecosystems. There's lots of options. There's also existing cloud platforms, right? You don't always need a blockchain. And the reason why I'm talking about this is because with the paradigm of new blockchain deployments becoming more and more common, you have a different set of users evaluating this, right? You have existing, kind of enterprise development teams thinking about bringing their business logic on chain. And when they're making that decision, they're evaluating the cost relative to just their existing backend setup. So they're looking at their AWS bill, which teams running blockchains are also looking at. So you have to understand that there's a different trade-off that teams are making than maybe they once were. The other thing is there are many teams that just rely on email and legal contracts. They don't have anything fancy. They're just signing agreements with people in person, maybe at a conference. And when you want to bring these kind of agreements onto a blockchain, they're kind of looking at this very, very simple setup. So again, nothing too important to focus on, but just want to kind of, I think, bring to light the fact that with existing chains and with new chains, there's a different trade-off that folks are going to have to make. Okay, so now on to more interesting things. So what are we seeing? Teams are now trying to deploy these things. There's a lot of test nets in production. What are folks actually doing with this technology now that we made, what once was something limited to a chain that you had to connect to something that you can totally mess with and do whatever you want. So this is just I think a sample. I think we posted this on Twitter a couple weeks ago of a few of the chains in deployment. So you have games, you have DeFi protocols, you have entire ecosystems kind of trying to come to market with an entire chain as opposed to an application on an existing one. I think one of the interesting things here is we're so early in this development cycle of chains that the types of applications we're seeing launch as chains today is going to be just drastically different than what it is in 6 months to a year, at least in my view. A lot of teams are still working on the core customizations. They're working on building their go-to-market strategy. They're trying to figure out, okay, how much do we actually want to spend per user? And so we'll see this develop, but there are a lot of teams considering chains, not only in the Orbit ecosystem, but also, the team that was just on stage, many, many ecosystems that are kind of growing today. So let me dive into a bit about what teams are using these chains for. So the obvious one that comes to mind is fee economics. There's two, I think, main dimensions here. One is custom fee tokens. You can kind of argue what the value and the purpose of this is, but there are many teams that want to kind of integrate their own native token for their project into the core protocol in some way that provides kind of a purpose beyond governance or beyond kind of the existing use case that they have for tokens, say fees in a game, as opposed to fees on the protocol itself. So they want to integrate that. They want to make it more kind of built in. The other interesting thing here is currently in a lot of the L2s, or at least the ones that kind of I focus on, there's not a direct incentivization mechanism to have more folks participate in securing the protocol. I'm not suggesting that this is something that we should do, but it is interesting to think about, right? If you run a validator on Arbitrum, or if you're a chain team that wants to launch, a network with another security model or an existing one, and you're recruiting folks to actually launch these validators and run them, currently the only reward you get is by winning a challenge, which on Arbitrum 1 mainnet has never happened. So if you're a new team coming to market and you want to bring a whole ecosystem of folks either running a DAC or running a validator, you have to think about the time and the effort it takes to actually run that. So beyond back-end deals and beyond commercial agreements, there might be, and some teams are actually considering this, one way or several ways to actually get them to participate. The other thing here, and this is, I think, probably the most interesting thing, is when you're running your own chain, the margin that the chain takes is up to you. So if you're running an L3, you can set the base fee to be nothing, and therefore, if you're sponsoring the transactions for all of the, let's say in a game, all the times the item is minted, that's free. And so you're paying for the overhead cost of the chain, but the users no longer have a associated transaction cost with them. So if you're a game that's trying to sponsor all of the transactions for all of the things that are happening in your game, if you're running the chain, that's much more cost effective for you. So it's something that we're seeing. The other thing that's probably interesting, but again, I think longer term, are core protocol changes. So people actually changing the state transition function to do something different or be more specific. So there's a lot of teams exploring adding custom precompiles to their network. So particularly with heavily mathematic or cryptographic operations that are going to happen in every single transaction that an application wants to do, they want to add this to the core protocol so it's more efficient for them. So this is something a lot of teams are playing around with. There are a lot of considerations with the validation end of things. So when you're making these changes, you have to be very careful. But this is something we're seeing a lot more than we previously anticipated. For instance, if you're trying to bring like an AI model on chain, you want to make that more efficient. Obviously, you're not going to bring a giant one, but there are things that you're going to do to make that more performant. Another thing is there's flexible DA layers. So obviously, teams are now evaluating the data availability solution they're using, whether that be Ethereum L1 or a DAC or Avail or any of the solutions available today. So teams, when you launch your own chain, you have that added customizability that you don't have when you're specifying where transaction call data lives on an existing L2. The other thing, and this is again for the larger enterprises that are kind of now considering tokenizing assets, or we hear like real world assets, they want to know who their users are. So permissioning the chain is something that we're seeing a lot. Again, RWAs have different requirements than like the canonical ERC20s that you or I may deploy kind of at will. So there's a lot of additional requirements that these teams are coming and bringing when they're thinking about launching their own chain. Again, KYC, AML flows. It's not super exciting, but it's important to remember that these are folks that are actually trying to participate in the ecosystem now. And another thing that we're seeing and working on bringing to the core protocol is the idea of a fully encrypted chain. Particularly within any trust chain, if you have a data availability committee, it's pretty trivial to encrypt the data that is coming out of the sequencer and restrict the access to the data availability committee itself. So again, this is not something that is particularly useful for, say, a DeFi chain or a gaming chain where you want to have all users be able to participate. But if you're trying to bring a select group of assets onto a network and you want to have things flow in and out and you want to restrict that use, this is something where deploying a separate chain is actually almost the easiest solution for you. Cool. So the other thing to think about here is now you have all these chains launching. How are they going to connect to each other? How are they going to talk to each other? Bridging between ecosystems today is already kind of hard to understand from a user perspective, and also evaluating the trade-offs with the different bridges is something that's pretty hard. I know we're working on public frameworks and trying to educate folks, but eventually we don't want to have to think about that, right, when we're sending transactions on a public network. So yeah, there's a growing number of solutions addressing key pain points. I think the first big area that is, I just mentioned is chain to chain, right? So if you have one chain, you want to send a message to another, you want to send assets over, we need to abstract this, we need to make this easier. So there's native bridging solutions in the core protocol, right, between the parent and the child chain, but to get from an L3 to another L3, you have to have something else. Maybe you need, kind of a bonding solution like Hop, a more flexible solution like Connext, but fast messaging between these chains, particularly confirming the execution state of one, is going to be incredibly important to solve. And I'll talk more about this in a bit. The other thing is user to chain, right? So if you have a new chain deployment, it's not like getting your funds there is the easiest thing in the world. If you're launching a completely separate chain, an entirely different ecosystem, you're going to have to call up these on-ramp providers and try to figure that out. Luckily, it's not super difficult if you're building on top of a chain that already has support from these services, because you can just kind of take your funds and bridge in and you already have that support. But it's really important to understand that there are these other differences that teams have to consider. Now, again, and then obviously account abstraction infrastructure, so relays, bundlers, paymasters, all of that stuff. A lot of teams, when they're deploying these chains, and I'll talk a little bit more about this, have to consider a lot of these services. And so solving this and getting this right and understanding, okay, per transaction, as the user base grows, how much you want to think about them having to pay for these transactions or you having to pay for them is something that I think we're seeing more development on. And the other interesting thing here that I'll highlight is just the kind of TradFi and DeFi solutions that I think don't really exist today. We don't see a whole lot of tokenized real-world assets on chain. But as this becomes more common, if it does, there's going to be interesting paths that are going to need to be built for liquidity to flow between the two. So something to consider. Okay. The other thing is we have lots of these roll-ups as a service team. So we work closely with all of the teams in the ecosystem, particularly called Era, Conduit, and Altlayer. It's interesting to think about before, when in the kind of pre-app chain era, we have these networks that are run by distributed participants. Now you have more chains run by kind of shared infrastructure. So it's important to think about that now we have this additional dependency, right? You have all of these chains operating on top of a shared stack. They might be using the same DevOps setup. They're kind of reliant on critical paths that they all share, as opposed to having kind of separate deployments. So it's important to think about, okay, how do we make sure that as more and more chains go live, using kind of a select group of deployment providers that we're actually getting the kind of guarantees and the reliability that we're used to, and we're also getting the decentralization that we want. And so again, a lot of times the user isn't thinking about this, but from a project team standpoint, long term, this is something that's important to consider. That being said, running a chain is hard, so I wouldn't recommend not working with someone. Okay, so now I'm going to talk a little bit about, I think, what's next, and this is hopefully the most interesting part. So I've hinted at this a bit. When you're launching a chain, it's different than launching an application, right? When you're deploying a smart contract on an existing chain and you're just trying to get users, you think about your marketing plan, okay, you're good. Now you figured it out, right? Now when you want to launch a chain, there's a lot of different components in the system that you have to be considering. So again, when you deploy an application on existing L2s or an L1, you plug into the existing infrastructure, right? So it kind of just works. Now, it doesn't always just work, but the assumption is that all of the services that are deployed on those layers are ready for you to use. When you deploy your own chain, you have to get them, or you have to convince someone who would otherwise be providing a service for free to actually support your chain. So it's a lot more complicated when you're evaluating this decision to think about this infrastructure. Again, on new chains, bootstrapping services takes time and resources. So you have indexers, right? All the subgraph solutions. Running, a subgraph node is not free. It takes time. It takes time for these things to sync. It also takes time for these things to be performant enough for you to get information, at the latency that you want. Reliable or beefy RPCs. Not all RPC nodes are created equal. Not everyone's internet connection is the same. So getting these services on your chain to allow your developers and your users to get requests in a timely manner costs money. It takes time, or you have to operate that service yourself. Again, another consideration you don't even think about when you're deploying an application on an existing chain. Explorers, block explorers are hard to make right. They are very related to, again, indexing and RPC nodes, but there's a lot of open source solutions like Block Scout, but there's also heavier kind of white glove solutions like Etherscan. And when you want to have kind of an ecosystem of developers on your chain, getting these teams to support you takes time. Again, wallets, making sure they integrate. This is kind of a smaller point, but even today, in most wallets, adding new networks takes time. So if you want users to use your application on a completely new network, and they have to add in an RPC field, and the chain ID, and the token, and they have to hit that flow, meanwhile they're responding to other messages or doing other things in their life, adding that other point of friction to their journey is time consuming. So again, it's just another thing. And this is also really, really trivial, but AMMs, I know you can fork UniV2 and just deploy it on your chain at will. Doesn't come out of the box. But it just takes time to get these things that you're used to having on existing chains on yours. There's also other issues, right? So decentralized operation and participation in the market. I mentioned this earlier with the idea of incentivizing validation, but it takes time, again, to get folks to learn how to spin up a node, make sure they have the right config, and they're pointing to the right set of services. Who's going to run these validation services? Who's actually going to issue challenges when something malicious is happening? Who's going to help you test that? If you want to make some changes, what's going to happen there? And then go to market. Again, not trivial to understand how to onboard users when you're launching a new project. The other thing to think about is, okay, you want to launch a chain or you want to launch an application with a chain and ecosystem. The whole time, the core underlying technology is changing at neck-breaking speed. I know we're in an interesting time in the market, but we're still all here, we're still all building. So things are changing, and so you're going to have to keep that in mind when you're thinking about, okay, how do I build my application? What am I going to be optimizing for when we haven't even ossified about what the scaling solution is yet, right? We're still debating which one makes sense. So if you want to launch an entire chain, you need to make sure that you're working with a solution that is actually going to keep up to date for you on its own. Again, the execution layer, so particularly at the roll-up level, has plenty of optimization headroom, right? We have cheap transactions now, but obviously we're in, again, an interesting market. Imagine if all the L2s were at capacity today and you had people kind of pouring funds in, we would be complaining about transaction fees like we've seen in the past. So things like compression, lots of room for optimization there based on kind of real-time flow. Sequencing has different optimizations that could be added. Client diversity, what I mean by this is right now, particularly in Arbitrum, we use a fork of Geth. There are other clients like Reth that are particularly more performant if you're using higher requirements for your nodes. Again, this is something to consider as a chain operator that the validators or the nodes operating on your network are going to have kind of a more expensive backend setup. But you get performance improvements with that. So again, something that we're going to see development in. And again, alternative proving systems. Right now in Arbitrum chains, we use interactive fraud proofs. There's obviously lots of room to grow there. Again, something that you might be familiar with is Stylus. So on Arbitrum Chains, we're working on kind of a new technological development that allows you to use other applications that compile down to WASM. There are lots of performance improvements, particularly with compilers in Rust and C, that make applications for memory and computation a lot more performant. You know, there are limitless applications of Stylus, and there are lots of other ways and lots of other languages that we're seeing people try to contribute to. Obviously, Go is a big one. I think one of the developers on our team kind of added support for Zig, which I've never used, but is really exciting. So what we're seeing now are teams build applications that were previously impossible because of the performance improvements that a technological development like Stylus brings. And this is not the only one. And the important thing here is, you know, obviously it's really exciting that you can do this, but the types of applications that are being built with these emerging technologies might totally, you know, might make other applications that we're used to totally irrelevant, right? So if you're thinking about building something, you have to keep in mind that, you know, the kind of assumptions you're making, the first principles that you brought when you scoped out your project could change overnight. So it's important to think about this. The other interesting thing, more from like a social consensus and like developer network side of things, is, you know, settlement consensus L1 layer is beginning to consider kind of enshrining features aimed at benefiting rollups into the core protocol. There's a new kind of rollup improvement framework developing. We're not seeing a ton of movement there yet, but it's obviously hard to get a lot of new stakeholders to participate. You know, 4844 was the start. We're really excited to kind of see that go live on mainnet. But as an example of like shifting targets, right? You know, we understand that there are different things that we need to optimize for. Now we're starting to think a lot about at the ecosystem level, kind of L2s and L3s, how we can make those things better. So again, the notion of performance improvements may come that you just aren't expecting. The other thing that I just want to highlight here is, you know, we've got a next generation proving architecture coming. This is called Bold. It's a new all versus all challenge protocol for rollups. But one interesting thing here that will come when this goes live is fast confirmation. So for any trust chains with the DAC, once that new challenge protocol is live, the DAC, as long as they're also operating as validators, will be able to instantly confirm execution changes in the chain. So what this means is you'll have native in-protocol fast messaging. So exit messages being sent out of any trust chains is going to be pretty quick. It'll be a lot shorter than 7 days, you know, in a matter of minutes or seconds, depending on how you configure the chain. And so now, when you're thinking about fast bridging or fast messaging, and you have an ecosystem of these AnyTrust chains, you have kind of a fast bridging native solution. And this is something that if you're say a gaming ecosystem, or you're a cluster of chains with a similar use case, forming a coalition or working directly with these teams, and that trust assumption of running a DAC being something that you can kind of, I think, de-risk becomes a lot more interesting. So again, I just want to highlight here that there's a lot going on. And the important thing here is if you're evaluating, deploying a chain, just take these things into account before you get started. So, okay, there's a lot going on, but what actually do we need to make this better? So for devs, we need a standard upgrade path. You deploy one of these chains, and then a new version of the node software comes out, new version of the smart contracts come out. Oh, okay, how do I do this? How do I upgrade, you know, these things that I never had to touch and never wanted to touch? So the good news is there actually is a standard upgrade path coming. We're working on something we're calling the Orbit SDK, which will make it very, very easy for you to maintain these chains as you deploy them. But it's important to think about, okay, versioning, something that we forget about sometimes, important in this environment. The other thing is hyper-performance state transition functions. And so what I mean by this is it might sound trivial, but you know, we're used to these generalized application chains like, you know, Ethereum, like Arbitrum. But once you start to go up the stack and you want to have only a specific thing done, like just payments, you know, in the original thesis with, you know, the first blockchain, you want to whittle that down. And so there are possibilities to actually just reduce the, you know, flexibility of your chain and make this much more performant and much cheaper. For users, again, effortless on-ramp and bridging. I can't say this enough. I've said this a million times, and obviously there are things we're doing to make this better. But we want to make it as easy as possible for folks to bring money on-chain. And so when you're using your credit card, you want to take fiat, you want to convert it, or when you want to move between chains, this should be completely abstracted from the user. There are different ways and different trade-offs to make this happen, but it's important to highlight again. Oh, sorry about that. The same point there. The other thing to consider, and this is more just to kind of leave you with a thought, is where will real-world assets live? And how will existing DeFi protocols compete and survive against a new wave of more restrictive assets or trading environments? And I don't mean to say they're one-to-one. If you want to talk about MEV or arbitrage, there's kind of different opportunities between the two. But you have this new kind of client base bringing liquidity on-chain, in a different environment than what we're used to or what the existing user base is used to, is going to be interesting. But it's also going to be really important to think about how those liquidity bases interact with each other and how we think about standardizing protocol changes to support one or the other. And we need to be really careful about that because it's very easy to be attracted to a lot of liquidity coming on and saying, all right, we'll make these changes to make sure that we can get this funds on chain. But you want to support kind of the values that we've already been pushing for. The other thing is how we deal with interchain MEV. So lots of kind of work being done on shared sequencing. We partner with Espresso. There are different solutions in the ecosystem. One of the big theses here with shared sequencing is that cross-chain MEV is net positive compared to single-chain MEV. The problem or the interesting thing here is currently if you look at L1 and Flashbots, you have a sufficiently decentralized protocol. They kind of added this maximally extractive MEV mechanism, and folks adopted that, right? But when you have a bunch of different chains with a bunch of different operators, you have now a much different audience that you're trying to bring a MEV mechanism to. And so getting them to agree on things like the fee, the ordering mechanism, the way that you can use different tokens to pay for, say, bids is going to be really interesting. And you might have kind of conflicts of interest that end up fragmenting this, this ordering scheme or sequencing generally. So it's just going to be, I'm really excited to see how that plays out, but something to consider when you're thinking about launching your own chain. Some teams might not even want to collect MEV from users because they're just going to protect that, or not. Okay, so I think with that, thanks for listening to me kind of go on about a bunch of different points. I'd be happy to take some questions if we have some time.
If anybody has questions, just raise your hand. We'll get a mic out to you.
So yeah, you had this RWA listed as one of the topics for us to think, but still wanted to get your input because, I mean, I kind of think about it all the time.
Sure. So just generally what I think about real-world assets?
Yeah, like how they live on chain and their like, one-to-one ratio and with the real world.
Right. I think, okay, at least from what I'm seeing, a lot of, how should I put this? What was it? Okay, yesterday I looked at L2B. We have, what, $13.8 billion locked in scaling solutions. That's a lot of money. And so if you're a TradFi institution, you're looking at that and saying, all right, I'd like to take a fee. And so, the classic thesis of banking and trade is, and these stakeholders are now really evaluating blockchain tech. And what I can share is that, at least in some of the analysis, these are hard to get access to, but from what I've been able to find, DAC chains in particular can be cheaper for some of these enterprises to run than paying their service provider to run their on-prem database. So we're now in this world where it's like, oh, actually, running these transactions on chain is cheaper. It's been a long time coming, but we're actually at this kind of inflection point where they're really considering tokenizing their assets because it actually saves them money. So it's unique, and they can get access to this liquidity base that already exists. So that's one interesting point. I think the thought here generally is because it's more performant and because it's potentially more open, they have access to a larger participating pool than ever before. So they're really starting to understand and try to evaluate the different scaling solutions. I don't have like a strong thesis on what this means. There's kind of a personal and professional opinion. I think the professional opinion is that obviously lots of different technology to use. Adoption is really critical for the space to grow. So anything we can do to help these clients kind of take advantage of blockchain tech is a net win for the ecosystem as long as it doesn't fundamentally change the kind of assumptions and the value set that the Ethereum ecosystem already has. The personal opinion is finance and trade have been relatively the same forever. And so now that we're kind of participating in a market with this kind of like DeFi ecosystem that's totally different than what we were used to, merging the two in terms of like a user journey, I think from a regulator perspective is going to be really interesting. So I'm not sure if that answers your question. It's hard to answer generally, but yeah, hopefully it's helpful.
Great talk. Amazing. I think, yeah, with the whole notion of RWAs launching, do you feel that the narrative of consortium chains that we saw back in 2015 and 2016 would pick up again? And that would be like the core use case of how things will work out for TradFi?
Yeah, it's an interesting thought. I mean, the superchain is in many ways an example of this. For developers, for users, you give them a shared set of expectations. My validator must look like this. My sequencer must look like this. Potentially, my state transition function must look like this. It's easier to just deploy apps in a shared environment. That's why, like, a consortium chain is essentially just an L2, but many different, kind of bandwidth layers. So I think yes, they will evaluate this. I think this will settle down to compliance. You have a bunch of stakeholders that have the same governing body. They want to operate on a similar development environment. So 100%.
Yeah, I think federated chains in particular, where the nodes are run, is very important in traditional finance.
Yeah.
Thanks.
So yeah, I have more of a technical question from the beginning of your presentation.
Sure.
Great talk. It's about the data availability layer for L3s.
Yes.
So you gave these two options, right, of the comedy or the rollup option.
Yes.
And the rollup L3 would settle on the L2, I guess, right?
That's right.
Right. And the L2, it's a rollup itself that settles on the L1.
Yes, so it's posting twice. That's
right.
correct.
So
yeah.
why do you need an L3 in this architecture, and what do you gain, since the L3 data at some point has to be posted on the L1 regardless, right?
That is the question, isn't it? Yes. Yeah, so yeah, this is something we got a lot. There's two things here. So one is, when you're an L3 and you're posting a batch to an L2, you're actually benefiting from the amortization of all the transactions that are happening on L2. So your batch is a transaction among other transactions on L2. And all of the costs of posting all of the data in the L2 batch are amortized across all the transactions in that batch on L2. So in a way, you're actually paying slightly less due to the fact that the L2 is a public network and fees are being charged to all users. So there's a slight reduction. There's no benefits in compression currently, but there's a benefit in amortization. So if you're running a rollup on a rollup, there are slight benefits you get due to the pricing structure, but generally, it's not something that you would do just to save money. But when you're thinking about that on the user end, you actually gain from one infrastructure kind of existence, right? So like an on-ramp. If it exists on Arbitrum 1 and you want to on-ramp users onto L3, they can fiat on-ramp and bridge in a single kind of user action. And that's something you don't have to worry about integration on your chain. But the other thing here is, if you're thinking about onboarding a bunch of users and you want to have them deposit funds from a parent chain into a child chain, if that's Ethereum and you're doing deposit transactions to the inbox on L1, that's really expensive on Ethereum. Like, look at the last few days when there's a surge in congestion. If you want to cover those costs for users, or if they're going to be paying for it themselves, deploying an application on L2, having them bridge in, that's quite expensive. Whereas if you're launching a separate network as an L3 and they're depositing on the L2, $5 versus 5 cents is actually very dramatic if you're looking at thousands of users. So again, just user transactions alone, I would encourage you to think about why you're deploying a separate blockchain, because you could just deploy an application on an existing L2. But there are ways to evaluate that as part of a greater framework. Yeah. Hopefully that answers your question.
Thank you.
Yeah. Cool. All right. Thank you.